Welcome everyone to the Pan-African Traders podcast. Today we've got a special guest, Tese, who is going to be talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area, or is it agreement? Maybe Tese can sort of clarify that. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation because it's something that's new, it's fresh, at least from the start of 2021, and I think it has a lot of potential. And so I'm going to be asking some questions around it and to see what that potential is really like, where we're really at right now, what are the roadblocks, etc. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. So Tese, welcome. Do you prefer being called Tese? I see Francis or Francis. How do I say your name? I don't want to get it wrong.
Oh, it's Tese. Tese is fine, actually.
Tese.
Yeah, Tese is fine. I prefer it.
Awesome. Is that where are you from originally?
I'm from Edo State in Nigeria.
Awesome, nice. Because you got a full-on American accent. So were you born there? Or were you born in Nigeria?
I was born in Nigeria, but I grew up in the US mostly.
Amazing. So yeah, welcome. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So I guess a good place to start would be just to get to know you a little bit. You know, who is Tese? I know it's a cliche question, to be honest, but what do you do, and how did you get into this space of the free trade area?
Well, yeah, okay, just like I am a trade expert. I'm into trade negotiations mostly. And I got into it because, well, I did economics for my first degree. My first master's is in entrepreneurship. And I got, like, after that, I got into policy. And then from there, I kind of got into trade pretty randomly, but also kind of because my dad is was involved in international affairs most of his career, and so that was like a field that I was kind of generally interested in. I got to take some courses in international trade and international economics while doing my first degree, and yeah, and just from working in policy, it just was a natural progression really for me to get into trade policy. But yeah, just like in summary, that's like how I kind of got into trade. I was working in public policy, and then I started working for a trade organization in Nigeria. And so from there, I got really involved in services trade negotiations, trade expertise, and the AfCFTA as a whole. I've worked with ECOWAS as well. I mostly deal with African trade and African trade policy, and especially the services side, which I just find really fascinating because it's kind of a developing field in the continent. We don't have a lot of trade agreements that really center services trade yet. And but the CFTA, that's just like one of the ways in which the African Continental Free Trade Area is focusing on, is very forward thinking, especially for African nations.
Amazing. Wow. So very, very interesting sort of background, and you've got a lot of experience in many different areas. You said you even worked with ECOWAS at one point. How was that? Because that's something when I got out of university, I considered looking into. So what was that experience like?
Well, working in the trade organization in Nigeria, I've had the opportunity to kind of work alongside and work with ECOWAS because, of course, Nigeria is one of the ECOWAS countries. And so working alongside ECOWAS has been really interesting because our relationship with ECOWAS and West African countries that are involved in ECOWAS is really, has what we refer to in trade as a high level of ambition, which basically means that it is very, very liberalized. Like our trade relationship with them is very liberalized. We have a lot of similar institutions, a lot of integrated institutions that you really don't get the sense of, really, I think, on a day-to-day basis if you're not working in this space. You don't realize like how really just how open our borders are when it comes to our relationships with other West African countries. And so that I found really interesting, just kind of finding out some of these things and like learning about, just how relatively easy it is to move things from one country to another in the West African region, how easy it is to move and establish yourself in other West African countries. Like one of the first times that like I really realized the relative ease of moving to maybe to establish myself in Ghana, for example, was when I had to go for a trip to like an ECOWAS meeting, basically. And when I got there, I just realized like you didn't need like a visa, you didn't need a visa, you didn't need anything other than really your passport, your Nigerian ECOWAS passport, and then of course just like your yellow card. And that is the same thing for that's like true whether you're just going there for like a short meeting or anything, or if you actually even want to establish yourself as a business in there, you have those rights. And I think that this is something that a lot of people may not be fully aware of, really just the extent to which we have these close ties with these other West African countries. Now, that's not to say that that these relationships are not are perfect as they are, right? There's definitely a lot of political, cultural issues that sometimes kind of prevent the ease of movement and limit the ease of like movement of people as well as the movement of products. And I'm sure some people have heard about the issues that we were having, for example, with Ghana some years back, where it was like kind of difficult for people who were Nigerian traders in Ghana to be able to continue to establish their businesses there because of cultural and political clashes. But there is that framework that exists where they do legally have the right to be in these places. And so that kind of, that when you compare that relationship and those opportunities that exist because of that relationship that has been developed through ECOWAS, and you kind of compare it to like our relationships with, like, for example, South Africa, or any other country in the world, really. So South Africa, for example, like we don't have, like prior to the CFTA, we don't have this kind of free, like, any kind of real like free movements between Nigeria and South Africa. We don't really have that. And so that has made it, and so whenever we have like political issues between South Africa and Nigeria, it makes it more difficult for people who want to, whether it's like, trade or export or import goods or services from South Africa or to South Africa, it makes it more difficult for them. So that's why like this whole opportunity of the CFTA and like its ability to kind of start to like, really break down a lot of these barriers to trade and kind of start to create, kind of a legal footing, a legal foundation for us to be able to have these open relationships, these integrated relationships that create more opportunities for Nigerians in various countries. That is really what I see as like a potentially useful goal, and that's why even with the CFTA, like the CFTA within the agreement itself, it states that it's building on the foundation of the RECs. Like it's building on the acquis of the RECs. And so it's using what has been established, what has been achieved by the RECs is kind of like a guiding framework to really create something that is that much bigger and that really transforms lives for people throughout the continent.
That's amazing. That's a lot. It's a lot of knowledge you're sharing with us already. Like I'm loving it. On that last point that you made, I was wondering how does that work when you have multiple sort of I'm not going to use a technical term here, but let's say trade blocks. Let's say you have ECOWAS and SADC in the southern part of Africa, and then you have the African Continental Free Trade Area on top of that. So this might be too much of a complicated question, really, but which one is more important? How do we know which one to follow? Do we sometimes have a conflict between the ECOWAS benefits and that of the new African Continental Free Trade Area?
All right, so that's a really good question, and I think that that's a question that a lot more people are going to have as we kind of as the CFTA starts to really transform and set up roots in like a lot of our institutions throughout the continent. And so basically the easiest way of kind of understanding this is that like any relationship, any agreement that we have, right, with other, the CFTA only transforms really our relationships with African countries that we don't have a regional, that we don't have a higher level of ambition of a relationship with. So how do I explain that? Basically, the CFTA let's say that the CFTA is aiming for a 90% level of liberalization. That means that they're trying to like kind of break down 90% of the borders, barriers, etc. throughout that limit trade. Let's say that they're going for like a 90% level of ambition, right? And so any agreement that you have that is above that 90% level of ambition. So like, let's say, for example, with ECOWAS, I believe that we're aiming for like almost like a 99% or 97%, but we're aiming for a very high level of ambition with ECOWAS. And so there are that agreement, our relationship with other ECOWAS countries is not going to be affected by the CFTA. Like, it's not going to be changed, right? So what the CFTA is not doing, or but when you think about the WTO, for example, right? Like we have with other ECOWAS countries, we have like this very integrated relationship with them, where we're like, a lot of things are relatively open or trying to be a lot more open. In terms of like the trade barriers are trying to be taken down. A lot of the trade barriers are trying to be taken down between us and other ECOWAS countries. But with the WTO, right? So for example, our relationship with like Ghana and a relationship between Ghana and Nigeria, we're both ECOWAS countries. We have a high level of integration that's actually higher than what is trying to be achieved by the CFTA. But with like other countries that may be, for example, we have just like an arrangement with them that's based off of the WTO, that's based off of like the GATS or the GATT. So based off the general agreement that exists at the level of the WTO, that's a much lower level of ambition. That's a much lower level of integration that we have with these countries. And so that's lower than what's trying to be achieved by the AfCFTA. And so that means that those agreements like that we would have with a country like maybe not Ethiopia, because Ethiopia is actually not even a part of WTO, but like, for example, with a country like Kenya, let's say we don't have like another like special agreement with Kenya, or the agreement that we have with Kenya is maybe just, if it's only like maybe at the level of the WTO, that's not as good as or as close of a relationship as the one that's being achieved by the AfCFTA. So that agreement is no longer going to exist, basically. That relationship is no longer going to exist once the CFTA really goes into force, because now people are always going to look for, like, countries are always going to look for the best and closest agreement that they have, so that they can really benefit the most from it. And so like basically if an agreement, if you have, for example, if at the level of the WTO you said that, okay, you still have to pay like taxes on this particular item if you're like coming to this country, But then that country, like, okay, between Kenya and like Nigeria, you say like at the level of the WTO, it says that you still have to pay taxes on like pencils if you're importing them from Kenya into Nigeria. But then you have the AfCFTA, which says that, oh, now based off of the AfCFTA and like what we have agreed on at the AfCFTA, you no longer have to pay taxes. Like, you don't have to pay tariffs on pencils anymore. They're obviously going to go for the AfCFTA agreement. And so that's why any agreement that is at a lower level of ambition, a lower level of integration, will no longer really have between the two nations that exist at the AfCFTA will no longer exist. They won't matter anymore once the AfCFTA goes into force. But any agreement that has a higher level of ambition than the AfCFTA, like any of our RECs, because all of our regional economic communities have a very high level of ambition. So like all of those are like not, those agreements are still going to exist, and they will take priority over any agreement that exists at the CFTA level, right? They're like, because they're at a higher level of integration. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, so it's like the RECs, as you call them, they're still going to be there. They're still going to be working, especially because they have more ambitious levels of integration. But if Nigerian wants to trade with a non-ECOWAS country, the AfCFTA will still be there to help to boost the trade and make it easier, etc. So that's really, really interesting. Whilst you're talking, I can see that you have so much like knowledge on this subject. So I'm curious to know what part of your experience, your professional experience, or even including your educational experience, did you really feel like you began to soak up the knowledge?
Well, honestly, a lot of what I've learned so far has really been as a result of the work that I've done in my professional career. Like, especially like I've been working in trade relations, and trade negotiations more specifically for the past 3 years now. And because I was very lucky to work alongside some very informed, very experienced people like the late Ambassador Chiedu Osakwe, who have really had a lot of experience in trade throughout their careers, and who have been like at the forefront of not just international negotiation, not just Nigerian based or African negotiations, but also international negotiations. And so that experience and like being able to work under their mentorship has really kind of guided me and informed the way in which I have been able to learn all of the things I've learned regarding the CFTA. But truly, the thing is that if you have like any kind of a background or really just an interest in these things, I think that it's like, for me, trade does have a lot of language that is a bit, it's not necessarily intuitive, but it expresses things that are real and that you can see the effects of in real life. It's like talking about how we move, how we buy and sell goods, how we exchange goods across borders. Like, this is a very, I think this is something that's very visible. Like, if you call out any actual like difficult things, that kind of like difficulties that arise because of like failures or breakdown in trade negotiations or trading relationships, like these are things that affect people's lives in a very real way, and that people can actually call back to. For example, like if you talk about like that thing that I mentioned earlier about like the situation with Ghana, and and like having Nigerian citizens kind of be chased out from Ghana, people who had established businesses there and like lost access to their businesses because of political unrest, or like because of just kind of a breakdown in the negotiating relationship, trading relationship that we had with Ghana as a result of ECOWAS. And so these are things that I think you can see them, right? So like you can really very easily see them because they really affect the way in which they're at the basis and the foundation of our economies. So that's, I guess, I hope that kind of answers your question, but that it's just, it is something that I learned through the experience, the professional experience that I've had for the past 3 years working on trade negotiations and working in trade negotiations, and especially particularly within services trade negotiations for the CFTA and for ECOWAS. But it's something that you can see the real true ramifications of it very easily in the news that you watch every day.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And when you were talking about your sort of professional history, you said something more than once, which I found quite interesting. You said you've worked in both trade relations and trade negotiations. Can you just clarify the difference between the two for the audience that might not be aware of what those mean?
Okay, so basically, trade negotiations is kind of like just a more specific area, a more specific part of the trading relationships between countries. So when I say trade negotiations, I'm actively just talking about, like that point in time, or like that part of the process where you go to, like, you have a meeting between representatives of two different countries, and they talk about how the agreements that you come to, the legal agreements that you come to, are going to guide how you will basically conduct trade between these two countries. So for example, two or more countries, right? So for example, trade negotiations are kind of like the first step, really, like the first phase in developing and like codifying what a trading relationship between two or more countries looks like. That's what the trade negotiation process really is. And then when you talk about like just trading relationships in general, I mean, it involves so much more than just the negotiations process, right? There's implementation that happens that also kind of, that implementation based off of what has been agreed on. That is also another important and necessary part of the trading relationship that exists between countries. And then, of course, you can talk about things like disputes resolution and dispute settlement, which is kind of like what happens when you realize that, oh, this country is not really keeping to what they've agreed to on the in this agreement that we've both signed. And so what do you do when that happens? Then you go into dispute settlements and dispute resolution. And so that is just another part of kind of what makes up the whole trading, the relationships between two countries when it comes to trade.
Interesting, very, very interesting. Yeah, these are things that I don't think the average Nigerian youth might not be aware of. So I guess, if you were to, if someone's listening to this and they're young and they want to do what you're kind of doing, what would you recommend they do? Where do they start looking into and getting into this field in particular?
If someone wants to get into this field, I guess it would really depend on like where you are currently in your career. Thankfully, and kind of over the past few years, I've like really felt this desire to share and to pass on this information that I have learned, because I'm really passionate about international trade and relationships. And I think that's just really a really fascinating space, but not a space that gets a lot of visibility unless you're in it. It's really strange. I find that really particularly odd, especially since I studied economics. I did a course on international trade, and yet the actual highlights of what exactly the field looks like is something that was not made clear to me while I was a student. And so if you're someone who is currently in school, or like maybe is getting into education, and you're trying to, and you think that international trade sounds interesting, I would typically recommend either taking doing like an introductory course, either or like doing your like degrees either in economics. A lot of people in trade have studied economics, or in international relation, or public policy, or something like that, something related to politics, political science, international relations, that kind of field. or that kind of space, if you can take a course in something similar, that usually helps as a gate into international trade. And then of course law is a very useful field for, like, if you're interested, especially in the negotiations part of trade, but honestly in trade in general, because it is at the end of the day the core of all of these agreements they are legal agreements. You know, the technical language comes from law. So so if you have a legal background, it tends to kind of give you like a leg up in the space. So, but if you're someone who hasn't studied any of these things, that doesn't mean that you can't get into international trade in different ways. I have friends who have studied communications, and friends who have studied, you know, really almost anything, and have now ended up in trade in different ways. And so it's kind of just a typical thing I would recommend is like doing as much reading as you can from relatively free resources. There's a lot of information on like the WTO websites regarding kind of just like some of the basic information on like all of this language surrounding different areas of trade. And if you start with that to kind of like give you a leg up so that you understand just basically what is being, like, you know, what are the relevant and pivotal issues in trade currently. And then I would typically recommend looking into like kind of like internships. Like WTO runs a lot of internships on trade. Then there's also like national and international organizations that have to do with trade or development, because trade and development tend to go very closely together. So like development organizations like UNCTAD, or organizations like GIZ, or you know, or even organizations, regional communities and their headquarters, their secretariats like ECOWAS, and you know, of course now the AfCFTA secretariat. These are places that sometimes either have internship programs or graduate programs, especially if they're older ones like the AU, for example. They typically have some of these programs that are a good step into the space, like a good first step into the space. And then of course there's like, you know, if you go like the government routes, you get involved in trade, whether it's in your own national ministry or your or any of their related bodies, you know, any of their departments or agencies. That's also another way into trade. So yeah, I hope that those are just some of the ways into trade and what the trade space looks like. But it's a very diverse space. Don't think that just because you don't have like a degree in law or economics or international relations, that means that you don't have a way into the space. Because I think that people often forget that trade is a very outward looking space. It requires a lot of communication and a lot of working alongside private sector individuals. And so if you're someone who has like that opportunity to even work alongside trade people, maybe even from the perspective of being someone in the private sector, that can also be a way to kind of start to make those connections, those relationships. And it also allows you to gain access to this information and to this knowledge, because they do need technical practitioners, people who are active in their fields, in their spaces, you know, kind of coming in and giving their specialized insights into the work that we're doing at a national or international level.
Fantastic. So I'm sure that with all that information and, you know, resources that you just gave out, I think the people listening in can definitely look into how they can tap in, because it's a really interesting space that you're in. And yeah, it's just not a space that you people really talk about very much. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. But just quickly to bring things back to AfCFTA, AfCFTA, the name itself is a bit difficult to remember sometimes, but what, I know this is a very cliche question, probably asked this millions of times, but what are the benefits for Africa with this new free trade area? I know it's a very simple question to ask, but sometimes the simplest questions are also the most difficult ones to ask. So what are the benefits for Africa, and what has been our sort of challenges so far, our limitations so far?
The benefits for the AfCFTA and what the limitations have been so far?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, great. So, well, so far in the process, right? Like the CFTA really only launched in terms of like trading beginning. Trading really only began at the beginning of this year in January. And so that was like the first phase of trading really under the CFTA. And that really only kind of opened trading for certain goods that have been negotiated under the agreement, that the rules of origin have kind of been negotiated and discussed and agreed upon under the AfCFTA. And so trading technically has begun under the CFTA for those goods that have been discussed and that the rules of origin have been agreed upon. But it's still very early on in the process. This is a progressive process, right? Liberalization is going to happen progressively over time. Even just kind of based off of the agreement itself, it talks about 10 to 13 years for the for like liberalization for goods, first of all. And then when it comes to services, for example, like we haven't services like has not really like the first five priority sectors for services trade negotiations have not actually trading hasn't begun under them yet, because the negotiating process is still being concluded on those first 5 priority sectors. And so some people have been able to benefit from the good side, and that have been able to, especially people who have been able to, take advantage of like their like the goods that they're already exporting or importing, and that these goods are things that that the tariffs have kind of been lifted to a certain extent, based off of this initial opening of and liberalization of trade that happened in January. So that has happened, but there's still a long way to go in terms of setting up these institutions that need to help kind of support the implementation of the AfCFTA, especially when you think about things like customs, right? And you think about how we are because we're kind of creating this large free trade area that involves 54 African countries, right? 54 out of the 55 African Union countries. We're looking at how to kind of create an integrated relationship between our customs, our individual national customs services. So what does that mean now? Like, how are we going to have our custom operators kind of like work together and develop systems that recognize the changes that are happening as a result of the AfCFTA? That's, of course, going to take some time developing those systems. And then, of course, developing the infrastructure that exists at the secretariats, of course. They, of course, have a lot of supporting work to do for the AfCFTA, but they're still establishing and fleshing out their internal structures to be able to really fully support the process to the level that they would ideally want to. And of course, that makes sense. It was only really launched, I believe, last year, the building and everything for the secretariats. And so it's still these are still very much early days in the process, but some people have begun to benefit from it. And then another thing is that it's what I think in terms of like benefits that have come as a result of CFTA already is just the fact that opportunities are already starting to be created as a result of the framework that is being built for the AfCFTA. There's this certain level of optimism and hope that the more people find out about it, that the more the average African citizen finds out about the CFTA and learns about it, the more opportunity is spotted within the framework of the agreement. And so people are already starting to create cross-continental, like throughout, like intra-African networks that are rooted in the private sector, intra-African networks that are going to that they hope will be able to take advantage of this CFTA agreement and use them to create opportunities that didn't exist before, create value chains, global and especially continental value chains that didn't really exist in the same way before, because now they see that the CFTA is going to make it easier for them to form these connections, to create these value chains that go throughout the continent, and to hopefully actually be able to start creating opportunities for African countries and African citizens for us to be able to kind of move out of the kind of creation and creativity that the kind of creation of products and the export of products and services that we have done in the past, and to allow us to actually move into sectors that we weren't as easily able to move into before, because we didn't have those levels of integration amongst each other or between our continents. And so now we're seeing like more opportunities kind of being created, where people are starting to create these organizations, these private sector bodies are creating these fairs and like these trade hubs and all of these things that are international, that are like, that involve various African countries, and that will hopefully actually create a space for us as a continent to be able to reclaim our economic narrative and to be able to actually compete not just within amongst ourselves, but really at an international level, and to raise our economic GDP in a way that creates opportunities for young people as we try to, as we try to really like develop the continent and move into the next stage of development.
That's awesome. I totally agree with you, especially when you mentioned about the sort of optimism and people already kind of building these structures, supply chains, new value chains, and thinking ahead of the curve. So it's very promising to seeing that kind of stuff going on. And like you said, it's a new agreement, and I think that the beginning stages have started. So I think eventually it's going to have a knock-on effect, and that snowball is going to keep rolling and rolling, and yeah, before we know it, we're going to be doing some amazing things. So thank you for sharing that. One thing that you mentioned really briefly was rules of origin. Can you explain what that is and how it applies to the African Continental Free Trade Area?
Okay, so the rules of origin basically is a set of rules, because of course the CFTA and any international agreement really is a rules-based system. And even though we are trying to reduce the barriers to trade, it's still trading based off of a rules-based system. And so the rules of origin specifically deal with how, with the rules that kind of guide what determines whether a certain good is technically seen as originating from a particular country. So how do you tell whether this yam that was made in Nigeria, that came from somebody's farm in the in the south, or like these tomatoes that came from somebody's farm in the north, like how do you tell that these are actually goods that were made locally within Nigeria, that are considered as local goods from within, for example, within ECOWAS or within the AfCFTA. So that's what the rules of origin basically is. It's basically a set of rules that determine whether a good is considered as local and originating from the area being considered, and whether it's seen as local or not determines whether you're able to benefit from the preferences and from the things that you would typically benefit from as being a member of that area, of that like agreement, benefiting from that agreement. So for example, if your good it's easy. It's kind of easier, I think, to a certain extent with like goods like agricultural goods, which don't have like, you know, a lot of additional value added to them, like the agricultural goods that don't have a lot of added value to them. But like when you think about things that go through a lot of processes before you get them developed, so or before they are sold to the customer. So for example, clothes, like finished item, like a finished item of clothing, so like maybe like a dress or a skirt or a pair of trousers, like what happens then? Like how do you determine that this good that was maybe like maybe the cotton came from the country that you were talking about, but maybe like, you know, it was maybe like the fabric that it was that the cotton, or like, you know, the items that you use to make the clothes, like maybe the actual fabric, the textiles that you use to make the clothes, they weren't from that country, or maybe they were from another continent, and now it's being sold. Does it technically still counts as local just because like the cotton that you use to make it is technically from this country? That's kind of like what is debated and discussed within the rules of origin. What makes a good seen to be as from that country that's being discussed, or from that you know, from that area that is being discussed, and therefore able to benefit from the benefits of the agreement, able to actually take advantage of the benefits of the agreement? What allows it to be able to do that? So that's basically what the rules of origin kind of guides. It generally within the rules of origin, you talk about things that are you know, that like there's like sometimes you like it's very important to the process, and it's very like pivotal, especially for people who are trading goods in the continent, because if you, it kind of also forms a basis that prevents dumping. You know, it prevents like kind of like people being able to just like send in goods from other countries that are, you know, maybe like low quality or relatively, or goods that were produced outside of the area. Like for example, if we're talking about the AfCFTA, goods that were produced from maybe countries outside of Africa, but they've been imported into like a particular African country, and that maybe this African country has done almost nothing to add value to that good. How do you then decide that, oh, is this good technically going to be seen as able to benefit for and compete with other goods in the market, in the AfCFTA markets, or will it not be allowed to? That is determined within the rules of origin, within the creation and the negotiation of the rules of origin. And so it kind of preemptively prevents things like, you know, unfair practices, unfair trading, where goods from third-party nations are not able to actually take advantage of the AfCFTA and benefit from it, but instead people, only goods that are created within the AfCFTA area are able to benefit from the to take advantage of the benefits from the AfCFTA.
Wow, fantastic. You've really broken that down very well. And yeah, it's just something that I keep hearing a lot. And yeah, like you said, you know, you don't want a country or a manufacturer from outside of Africa flooding the Nigerian market, for example, with a product, and then saying, you know, claiming that it's made in Nigeria and then trying to export that and benefiting from the agreement. So thanks for sort of clarifying that. I think, you know, you've really done a great job in explaining it. We might have to do a part 2 in a few months after things has progressed a little bit, but you've definitely shared a lot of amazing knowledge. And I think, you know, the amount that you've shared is good enough for people to go back to the drawing board and really understand, you know, at least the basics, understanding the basics of trade relations, trade negotiations, the new free trade area, what it means, how it interacts with the different, you know, trade blocks, etc. So it's fantastic bits of information you've shared, and yeah, I'll leave it there. But before we do, I'd just like for you to maybe share your social media handles, or promote anything that you're working on. Anything really that you think is worth sharing will be good to just hear from your side before we close things off.
Oh, all right. Well, you can follow me on social media. I'm at Tese the Poet. on most platforms, like on Instagram and on Twitter, especially. Those are spaces where I tend to be on. But yeah, I'm Tese the poet because I'm actually also a performance poet. So I do that alongside trade.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, that's something that I'm really passionate about as well. But I also would encourage you, if you have any questions, especially if you're a young person, and you're kind of curious about learning more about what all this is, but really anyone, I'm always happy to answer any questions that people have about like the CFTA or just like trade negotiations in general. I'm actually a mentor with WIAN, which is a woman in international affairs program, which is kind of a mentorship program, and I find it really helpful to, I think that it's really good to have opportunities for people to have these conversations, and to really break down the agreements or even break down just like trade in general, because the more people that understand trade and the more people, especially working in different areas, in different parts of the private sector, that understand trade, the more helpful your inputs can be into our process, so that we can actually create things as members of, like whether it's like as government representatives or anything, where we can actually create, agreements and all of these things that actually are informed by what you need, and therefore are better able to transform the lives of African citizens, because all of these things, they need to exist off the page, and the only way for that to happen and for them to truly be transformative is we get the valuable input of members of the private sector. So definitely thank you so much for this opportunity. You can also find me on LinkedIn with this name, Tese. You can look me up on Tese Ohumoibi on LinkedIn. And yeah, feel free to reach out. I'm always willing to talk and share information.
Amazing. That poet stuff is actually really interesting. I didn't know you're a part-time poet. So do you have that do you have it written down, or do you do like spoken word? What kind of where can we start, taking in some of the poems you've created?
Oh, well, actually, if you follow me on like Instagram or Twitter, I'm currently working on like my author website. But I have poetry published online in different spaces. I have like I think 2 or 3 books that I've been like 2 or 3 anthologies that my poetry is currently within. For example, one of them is on Amazon currently. It's called Rewilding, an eco-poetic anthology. I mostly do I consider myself a performance poet, but not so much spoken word. But a performance poet, and I do a lot of like page poetry that's experimental. So, and it basically focuses on African folklore, nursery rhymes, and just other childhood artifacts. Basically, uses these things as kind of like a tool to explore childhood experiences and trauma and just different things. And I use those as vehicles to kind of, like write my poetry. So that's what I do as well.
Amazing. That's super interesting. So trade expert and poet part-time, Tese. It's been fantastic having you on the podcast. And yeah, please reach out to her. She's got an absolute wealth of knowledge. We actually met on Clubhouse, and yeah, I thought we need to get her on. So thanks again, Tese, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me.
All right, bye.
Bye.